Hey guys, today we'll step away from the dry pages of books and enter a world filled with fragrance, mist, and the strange intoxication of herbs in the Middle Ages. Yes, they really did it. And trust me, sometimes things turned out bizarre, yet unexpectedly creative. Before we set off on this journey together, take a moment to hit, like, and subscribe. But only if you truly feel what I'm doing here is worth it. And don't forget to leave a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? I'm always excited to see viewers from all corners of the world gathering here. Now then, dim the lights and leave a little haze of darkness. If you can, turn on a fan so the soft hum carries you into an ancient atmosphere. And let's set off together, slowly, dreamily, into tonight's journey. Do you believe it? Back in the Middle Ages, drinking beer wasn't some fun pastime, it was literally how people didn't die of thirst. That's right, you heard me. Instead of holding a glass of crystal clear water like we do today, medieval Europeans held a cup of weak, watery beer, so light you'd barely call it booze, but strong enough to keep their stomachs from turning into a bacteria factory. Well water, river water, rainwater, all of it could be mixed with human waste, animal dung, and every kind of filth. Drinking water back then was like playing Russian roulette with death. Maybe you'd survive, or maybe you'd be laid out with dysentery in a few days. That's why beer, even just small beer with super low alcohol, became the daily drink of men, women, and even kids. Picture a morning in a medieval village, farmers grabbing their plows, kids sipping weak beer instead of fresh milk, and an old woman in the kitchen stirring porridge while taking a sip to warm her belly. This wasn't partying. It was survival. But the story doesn't stop there. When you live in a world without Starbucks coffee to keep you awake, no painkillers for your headaches, and no Netflix to escape boredom, you'll try anything to make life a little less miserable. Medieval people looked around their fields, forests, even their backyard gardens, and asked themselves, what if I chew this root? What if I drop that flower into wine? What happens? And that's how a strange journey began. One where the line between medicine, mystical elixir, and deadly poison was thinner than a spider's thread. Now imagine walking into a tavern in some little village around the year 1300. The wooden door creaks open, smoke from the hearth mixes with the sour smell of ale and the musk of unwashed wool. In the dim light, old men huddle telling tales. A farmer waves his arms arguing over land boundaries, and in the corner a few drunks laugh while pulling out their daggers. Here, beer wasn't just a drink. It was fuel for stories, rumours, and every kind of social bond. Sometimes, right from these taverns, whispers about witches flying at night, or screaming roots, spread faster than the king's official messengers. In a society without electricity or modern medicine, people believed strange plants could open doors to other worlds. A farmer might swear that chewing certain leaves at night let him meet God in his dreams. A monk might see it as a path to holy revelation. Meanwhile, a village healer with a bundle of strange roots could cure children's fevers, while neighbours whispered she had made a pact with the devil. Medicine, faith, and sorcery were all tangled into one chaotic picture. And here's the kicker. Medieval people didn't think they were getting high the way we'd say today. For them, it was a vision, a divine gift, or maybe just a simple remedy for toothache. But put yourself in their shoes. It's a freezing winter night. You sip a tea brewed from henbane roots, and suddenly the tree outside your house starts talking to you. Do you call that alkaloid hallucination, or do you believe you just spoke with your ancestors' spirit? In the Middle Ages, the answer leaned heavily toward the second. That's the beauty of it. The medieval world had no sharp line between science and superstition. A monk might copy down the medicinal uses of henbane in his herbal manuscript, but right next to it he'd warn, beware, lest demons deceive through this root. A healer could save dozens of lives with mandrake-infused wine, only to be dragged to the stake as a witch. A noble woman might drip belladonna into her eyes to look more alluring at a feast, while unknowingly poisoning herself bit by bit. So when we look back at the Middle Ages, it's not just some dark era like movies often paint it. It's a world where people wrestled with disease, with boredom, with the darkness of ignorance, and they used whatever they had on hand to fight back. Sometimes it was a cup of weak beer, sometimes a mandrake root, and sometimes just a whispered prayer rising through a smoky hut. That's why, as we start this journey into the Middle Ages, and intoxicants. Remember, this isn't just a story about weird herbs or monastery wine. It's a story about people not so different from us, searching for comfort, a little happiness, and sometimes a brief escape from brutal reality. So now, let's step deeper into that world, where a pint could save your life, a leaf could lead to the divine, and one wrong dose could send you to meet God a little earlier than planned. Among the many plants that could make a medieval mind spin like a top, henbane, the deadly nightshade, held a special place. It wasn't just a herb, it was a whole mood, an attitude of the era, respected as medicine, feared as a tool of the devil. Monks copied it into their herbals, healers used it for pain, witches mixed it into their ointments, and peasants simply prayed they wouldn't accidentally eat it. And of course, there were always a few drunkards curious enough to sip a cup of henbane tea, only to swear they had turned into a duck. Henbane wasn't something you wanted to stumble across when you were hungry and decided to chew a leaf. In small doses, it was a savior, easing toothaches, calming sleeplessness, helping women endure the agony of childbirth. Picture a medieval mother lying on a straw bed, the only light a flickering candle. The midwife hands her a sip of henbane water, and in that moment of life and death, the pain eases just enough to bear it. In that instant, henbane wasn't poison, it was grace. But all it took was one extra pinch of leaves in the pitcher, and grace turned to curse. Instead of drifting into sleep, the drinker began to shiver, their eyes darting, mouth parched. And soon, in a panic, they bolted into the yard, screaming nonsense and running barefoot, swearing the hens were calling them to a fight. To us, that's alkaloid poisoning. To medieval people, that was possession. And the truth, both are correct, depending on whether you believe in science or theology. That danger was exactly what made henbane both fascinating and terrifying. A healer might grind its seeds into a paste to soothe aching joints. A monk might burn its leaves in a censer, letting the smoke help worshippers sleep deeper during endless prayers. But a witch, or rather, a woman accused of being one, would use those same leaves to brew a flying ointment. Just a little rubbed on the skin, absorbed through the pores, and soon the user felt as if they were lifting off the ground, flying on a broomstick through the night sky to feast with demons. In reality, their body lay limp in a dark hut, eyes rolling, lips muttering nonsense. But in their mind, it was a supernatural journey, and if you woke up the next morning, you'd swear you had truly flown. No wonder the church looked at henbane with suspicion. A vision? Fine. If it was a saint, acceptable. But if it was a barefoot peasant woman claiming she'd seen angels in the henbane smoke, that was surely the devil's trick. And so, a plant once grown in monastery gardens for pain relief became evidence in witch trials. Even more curious, henbane found its way into beer. Before hops became the official ingredient, many regions brewed with henbane. The result? A drink that didn't just get you tipsy, but could make the walls smile at you, or convince you that the dog in the corner was preaching the gospel in Latin. Tempting? Maybe to some. But the hangover was brutal. Villages witnessed feasts turning into chaos, people laughing maniacally, dancing like the possessed, and some collapsing dead as their hearts gave out. In the end, the madness was so great that henbane was banned from beer, replaced by the safer hop plant. Still, henbane's reputation didn't die. It lived on in legends, in rumours, in medical texts. Some old manuscripts note that henbane brings sleep and tranquility. But on the very next page, it also brings madness and death. That was henbane's eternal contradiction. Saviour or killer. The answer depended on the hands that used it. If you put yourself in the shoes of a medieval peasant, the picture gets even darker. One day you hear that Bernard, the village storyteller, suddenly declared himself a duck. He stood in the yard, flapping his arms like wings, quacking loudly, swearing he'd fly south before winter. The villagers laughed, until he foamed at the mouth and collapsed. They carried him inside, prayed, lit incense, and whispered, "The devil has taken him." No one knew it all began with a mug of beer brewed wrong, laced with henbane. To us, a textbook case of poisoning. To them, solid proof that demons walked among them. Henbane, then, was a mirror of medieval psychology. Anything beyond comprehension was dressed in the cloak of the supernatural. An alkaloid hallucination? No, A vision from God or temptation from Satan? A seizure from poisoning? No, a curse. And that blur made henbane both part of medicine and part of heresy trials. Yet, setting aside the horror, you have to admit, henbane saved lives. It was the anesthesia of the Middle Ages, long before morphine or surgical anesthetics. When a blacksmith shattered his leg, when a soldier lay bleeding on the battlefield, diluted henbane could send them into sleep before the blade came down. Maybe they woke again, maybe they didn't, but at least the pain didn't consume them. And in a world where pain was a daily sentence, anything that could bring peace was seen as a miracle, even if that miracle was fragile and cruel. Mandrake, the ginseng of the Middle Ages, with its human-shaped roots and a scream said to kill anyone who dared to pull it from the ground. Just imagine it. Darkness covering the fields, someone kneeling with trembling hands clutching the stem, and when the root bursts free, the air fills with a piercing shriek that freezes blood in the veins. This wasn't just folklore. It was a collective nightmare that haunted people for centuries. Legend said mandrakes sprouted from the semen or blood of a hanged man, seeping into the soil and giving birth to the root. Because of that dark origin, people believed the root carried a soul, shaped like a little human with head, arms, and legs. When you dug it up, that soul was torn from its body, screaming in torment, and anyone who heard it would drop dead on the spot. So, those who dared to harvest mandrake had to follow strict rituals, dig carefully around the stem, tie a rope to it, and fasten the other end to the neck of a black dog. Then, under the moonlight, they commanded the dog to run. When the root ripped free and shrieked, the dog died in its master's place. The tale sounds both gruesome and absurd, but for medieval people, it was truth. And the image of a loyal dog dying to save its master from the mandrake curse became one of the strangest symbols in the history of herbs. Mandrake wasn't just feared, it was hunted like treasure. In ancient medicine, people believed the root could numb pain, act as an anesthetic, even stir up desire. A medieval doctor might chop up mandrake, soak it in wine, and give it to a patient before surgery. Picture a warrior with a broken bone after battle, lying on a wooden table, sweat pouring down his face. Before the blade came down, he was forced to drink a cup of mandrake wine. Within minutes, his eyes grew hazy, his mind drifted into delirium, and his screams faded away. For the doctor, mandrake was a blessing. For the patient, it was a brief escape from unbearable agony. But no miracle came without a price. Dosage was a gamble between life and death. Take a little, and it was like sipping weak wine, light-headed, blurred vision, a racing heart. Take more, and you fell into strange dreams where faces morphed, loved ones turned into demons, and you soared across fields with burning wings. But too much? The body trembled, muscles spasmed, breathing faltered. Instead of sleeping, you never woke again. That fragility made mandrake a double-edged sword, a gift of the gods if used wisely, a death sentence if abused. And so mandrake stepped out of medicine and into myth. People believed it brought luck, warded off demons, even made families wealthy. Many paid fortunes for a human-shaped root. They bathed it, dressed it in tiny clothes, placed it in wooden boxes, and hid it like treasure. One story tells of a nobleman who whispered to his mandrake root before battle, convinced it would protect him from spears. The next day, he returned, missing an arm. The mandrake still there, silent and soulless. In smoky taverns, mandrake became the stuff of rumours. Some swore they saw the root wiggle its fingers. Others claimed it whispered secrets about buried treasure in the dead of night. A village healer insisted mandrake cured a child's fever, while her neighbour swore it killed his cow. No one knew the truth, only that mandrake, with its eerie shape, always stirred a mix of fear and desire. What made it even more terrifying was the sound, the scream. Think about it. In an age with no knowledge of toxins or neurology, someone collapsed while digging a root. Maybe it was poisoning, maybe just fear stopping their heart. But to villagers, it was undeniable proof that mandrake's scream was real. Once the rumour spread, collective imagination turned it into fact. Those invisible screams echoed in people's minds for generations, becoming a hereditary terror. Mandrake even seeped into popular culture of the time. In illuminated manuscripts, it was drawn as little human figures with big eyes and stubby limbs. Some showed the black dog pulling it from the ground, while the master covered his ears. The obsession grew so strong that heresy courts used mandrake as evidence. A woman accused of witchcraft needed only a mandrake root in her home to be condemned to the stake. Something once seen as medicine became a one-way ticket to execution. The medieval world didn't see mandrake as just a plant, but as a living being caught between human and demon, friend and enemy, savior and killer. In a doctor's hand, it was anesthesia. In a witch's hand, it was a key to the other world. In a fool's hand, it was a death sentence. That ambiguity made mandrake the perfect symbol of the era, a time when science, superstition, and nightmare blended together in a scream rising from the earth. If mandrake was the root that screamed from the earth, then belladonna was a deadly seduction written right onto the human face. Its name, belladonna, beautiful woman, sounds sweet, like an Italian love song, but the truth is far darker. During the Renaissance, and even in the Middle Ages, noble women and queens dripped belladonna extract into their eyes to make their pupils dilate, their gaze dreamy and luminous. But behind that enchanting look was a heavy price: blurred vision, dizziness, even blindness. In other words, to be called beautiful, they slowly turned themselves blind. Belladonna grew humbly in the forest, its glossy black-purple berries shining like tiny pearls. Children and berry pickers often mistook them, popped one into their mouths, and death followed so quickly no one had time to understand what happened. They said just a few berries could kill a child, and a handful could wipe out a whole family. And yet, the paradox. This same plant appeared in the healer's medicine chest and the noble woman's cosmetic kit. A painkiller, an anesthetic, a beauty enhancer, all wrapped up in a single leaf. In a physician's hand, belladonna became a tool of medicine. Its leaves and roots contained alkaloids that could relax muscles, ease intestinal pain, even soothe patients before surgery. Picture a battlefield infirmary, soldiers screaming from bleeding wounds, the healer dripping a few drops of belladonna extract into wine and forcing it down a soldier's throat. Within minutes, the pain eased, his eyes widened, staring blankly as if seeing an angel. But in truth it was just a distorted blur caused by fully dilated pupils. In those moments, belladonna felt like a gift from heaven. Yet, in the hands of a witch, or rather, someone accused of being one, belladonna turned into proof of sorcery. Mixed with henbane and mandrake, it became the infamous flying ointment that sent users into visions of riding broomsticks through the night sky. Many testimonies in witch trials described smearing the ointment, then seeing oneself at a sabbath with demons, and belladonna was always there. If henbane opened the door to hallucination, belladonna painted them vivid and surreal, like a living dream. Medieval people didn't have the word psychedelic. They simply called it revelation, or Satan's temptation. What made belladonna unique was its ironic tie to women. The beauty ritual of dripping it into the eyes wasn't rare. Imagine a lady at a banquet, candlelight flickering, her pupils wide, her gaze dreamy as if lost in love. The crowd whispered, "She is beautiful." But only she knew her heart was racing, her head spinning, her vision blurring like looking through wet glass. To be adored, she sacrificed clarity. A dangerous game, where love and death were only a few drops apart. The story spread quickly through noble courts. Like a collective game, those with wide, glowing eyes were admired. Those who used too much vanished from the banquet soon after. Some were lucky, left with temporary blindness. Others were crippled for life. But the reputation, belladonna, the deadly beauty, only grew louder. In the villages, belladonna wasn't tied to glamour, but to nightmares. Midwives kept a few dried leaves to treat children burning with fever. But when a child died, from illness or overdose, the presence of belladonna was enough to convict. To peasants, this plant both saved and killed, like a gleaming double-edged dagger in the dark. There's an old tale of a farmer who, one night, saw his wife wandering in her sleep. She went to the garden, plucked a few belladonna berries, and ate them while laughing. Terrified, he dragged her back inside, but by morning she lay lifeless, eyes wide, pupils blown. The neighbors whispered, "The devil took her soul." No one knew she had only been another victim of the same berries the village feared. From then on, the garden was abandoned, belladonna spreading wild, a living monument to a death never explained. It was this bond with women that turned belladonna into a symbol of danger, hidden inside beauty. In witch trials, a vial of belladonna, or a pouch of dried berries, was enough to prove she had bargained with the devil. No one cared that. Physicians in the cities were using the same plant to treat seizures or eye diseases. In medieval society, the rules were harsher than logic. And if henbane was tied to brief intoxication, mandrake to terrifying screams, then belladonna was the gaze, a gaze that could enchant, but also be the last thing you ever saw before the dark closed in. It was the embodiment of allure and destruction, of desire and death. One drop in the eye, and you became a goddess at the feast. One drop too many, and you became a corpse carried out of the hall. In the Middle Ages, no one knew where the line was, until it was too late. If belladonna was the glittering poison in a noblewoman's eyes, then when it was mixed with henbane and mandrake, you got the most dangerous cocktail of the Middle Ages, the flying ointment. This was the gateway to one of the most haunting images in Western culture. Witches soaring across the night sky on broomsticks, cloaks flapping, laughter echoing. But the truth was far less glamorous, and far more unsettling. These were just people lying motionless on the ground, drenched in sweat, mumbling, while in their minds they were flying through visions no one else could verify. The recipe for this ointment wasn't found in medical books, but in whispered tales, smudged notes in inquisitorial records, or the fading memories of village healers. It was usually made from crushed henbane leaves, chopped mandrake root, belladonna berries, sometimes mixed with resin or animal fat. Rumors spread that for it to truly work, it had to be blended with the fat of a black cat, a frog, or even an unbaptized infant. Whether true or not, such whispers were enough to turn the ointment into the ultimate symbol of evil in the eyes of the church. This was not a potion to drink. It was rubbed directly onto the skin, onto sensitive areas like the armpits, the groin, or even onto the handle of a broom. As the skin absorbed the alkaloids from henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, the user slipped into a dreamy, half-conscious state. Reality faded, replaced by visions, the body lifting from the ground, gliding through forests, skimming rooftops, landing in a field where hundreds gathered for a frenzied festival. In that hallucination they heard wild music, saw roaring fires, danced with demons, struck bargains with nameless creatures. So when a woman confessed in court that she had rubbed the ointment and flown to a feast with Satan, she might not have been lying. In her mind, the flight was real, the experience as vivid as any memory. Her body, meanwhile, remained on a damp straw bed, eyes shut, mouth twitching with bursts of laughter or screams. To her neighbours, the sight was terrifying, and fear turned quickly into accusation. The broom itself, forever tied to the image of the witch, was originally nothing more than a kitchen tool, a stick bound with twigs for sweeping ashes. But when people believed the ointment was applied to the broom handle, then straddled for better absorption, the broom transformed into a symbol of flight. A simple household object became the devil's aircraft. And over the centuries, that image fused into Western imagination, the witch and her broom, an immortal pair. It isn't hard to picture a medieval night. The village quiet, the moon hanging above, and someone swearing they saw a shadow fly over the rooftops. Maybe it was just a large owl, or a distorted shadow thrown by firelight. But once the rumour started, the village buzzed. Lonely women, widows, or herbalists were quickly branded suspects. And if a jar of foul-smelling ointment was found in their hut, the Inquisition had its undeniable evidence. To modernize, the flying ointment was nothing more than a hallucinogenic salve, packed with toxic alkaloids. But to medieval minds, it was proof that the devil was real and calling humans to his side. A priest might watch a parishioner collapse mid-sermon, eyes rolling, shouting that she was flying into the sky. He wouldn't think of plant poisoning. He'd only see Satan's hand dragging her soul away. And just like that, another name was added to the list of witches. The story of flying ointment also revealed humanity's hunger to escape reality. Medieval life was suffocating. Plague, war, poverty, the harsh grip of the church. In such a world, the idea of flying away to a festival where no rules applied was irresistible. The ointment wasn't just a hallucinogen. It was a symbol of secret rebellion, an imagined journey to freedom, bought at the price of health, life, or reputation. Many modern scholars believe that countless witch trial confessions were simply descriptions of hallucinations caused by the ointment. A woman describing fields ablaze with light, animals speaking, and herself rising into the air. All of it matches the symptoms of henbane, mandrake, and belladonna. But in the medieval context, those words became proof that the devil is real, and he gathers with humans. From these testimonies, the image of the witch's Sabbath was born: dark feasts, wild dances, orgies, and sacrifices. Reality was likely just one person convulsing on a bed. Some theories even suggest that many possessions were really victims of the ointment, a young girl writhing, screaming that she saw demons in her room. Modern medicine calls it hallucination, but for her priest, it was proof of Satan's presence. To save her, they bound her, performed exorcisms, sometimes until she died. In such tragedies, the flying ointment wasn't a door to freedom, but a fast track to the flames, both figurative and literal. The striking thing here is the blur, a substance that could be medicine, a weapon, entertainment, or evidence of sin. Depending on who told the story, it changed shape. To a healer, it was experimental medicine. To a priest, the devil's bait. To villagers, the frightening secret of old women in the woods. And to the ones who used it, maybe it was the only time they ever felt like they could fly away from a crushing life. While common folk had their flying ointments to escape into hallucinations, the church had its own kind of stimulant, fragrant resin incense. And strangely enough, its effects weren't all that different, taking people out of reality. Thick clouds of smoke filled the cathedral, the scent sweet, sharp, and slightly acrid, winding into the nose, sliding into the lungs, making the head float. People called it the fragrance offered to God. But ask a modern scientist, and he'll smile and say, "Hello there, neurological effect." Frankincense and myrrh, not just the gifts of the Magi to the infant Christ in the Bible. In medieval Europe, they were the inseparable pair of every church service. Picture it. A morning mass, hundreds of worshippers crowded into a cold stone church with no glass windows, dim light falling through narrow slits. The priest lifts the censer, swinging it gently, and bluish-white smoke unfurls like clouds. It's so thick you can barely see the person beside you. You breathe in, your head spins slightly, your heartbeat slows. At the same time, Gregorian chants rise, steady, hypnotic. You bow down, and suddenly you feel you're no longer in the church, but staring at an angel. Many records tell of monks experiencing visions after long hours of prayer in rooms heavy with incense. One claimed he saw the Virgin emerge from the mist. Another said he heard the voice of God inside his head. In reality, it was probably the mix of fasting, sleep deprivation, spiritual strain, and a light dose of neuroactive compounds from the resin smoke. But in the medieval world, no one used the word hallucination. They called it grace. What's fascinating is that incense created a collective effect. One person high might be called insane, but a whole community high together became a miracle. When the entire church inhaled the same substance, hearts slowing together, heads swimming together, and all voices joining in one hymn, the synchronicity made the experience feel even more real. You couldn't doubt your eyes, because your neighbor swore he saw the same light. And so, a personal hallucination became a collective truth. In grand festivals, incense was burned so heavily that smoke rolled out into the streets. They said that during certain processions, the whole parade moved inside a fog so thick they looked like a ghostly army. Onlookers at the roadside stood in awe and fear, convinced they were witnessing the divine. In truth, they were just inhaling a cocktail of burning oils. The dark humor here is that incense, considered the bridge between man and God, was also a kind of legal high. If a village healer was caught burning henbane to summon spirits, she'd be burned alive. But when the church burned frankincense to summon God, the entire community knelt and sang. The only difference was in the name. One was called sorcery, the other sacrament. But in the brain, the biology was the same. Plant compounds altering the nervous system, convincing people they'd touched the other world. There's a story of a young monk who, during an Easter vigil, prayed so fervently he collapsed in the smoke. He jumped up, eyes wide, saying he had seen Christ reaching out to him. The rumor spread, and overnight he became the chosen one. But days later, when sober, he admitted, "I don't remember anything. just dizziness and blinding light. Too late. The community had already written the story for him. He was forced to live on as the visionary, because no one wanted to admit they'd just been high on resin smoke. Put yourself in the shoes of a medieval worshipper, and you'll understand. Life was poverty, constant illness, death always nearby. In the church, you were wrapped in perfume, hypnotic music, echoing prayers. You knelt and felt you were no longer in a filthy village, but at the gates of heaven. For a moment, the misery of the world dissolved, and for medieval people, that feeling was worth more than gold. If incense smoke in the church made people see angels, then beer in the tavern made them see life as a little more bearable. In truth, beer was the backbone of medieval society, a kind of superfood that covered up many of the era's shortcomings. Think about it. Well, water was murky, river water was full of waste, and rainwater carried filth from thatched roofs. Drinking water was basically rolling dice with death. So peasants, nobles, monks, and even children all turned to beer, but not the golden frothy lager we know today. Rather, a cloudy, sour, thin drink with just enough alcohol to kill bacteria and leave you a little lightheaded. On a typical day, a peasant might drink several litres of this small beer without ever getting drunk. It was more like a lightly sweet mineral water, safe enough for children, energizing enough for farm work. But when the sun went down and the oil lamps were lit, people turned to stronger brews, wine or mead to warm their stomachs and forget their troubles. And in making these drinks, no one played a bigger role than the monks. Medieval monasteries weren't just places of prayer, they were beer factories. Monks, with their strict discipline and lands granted by the church, quickly became masters of brewing. They cultivated barley, harvested honey, gathered herbs, and carefully recorded every recipe in their manuscripts. Many famous beer brands today still carry traces of that tradition, recipes first tested in cold stone corridors of monasteries. There's even a story that during long fasting periods, monks were allowed to drink beer instead of eating, because beer is liquid, not food. And so, entire communities of monks survived Lent by downing litres of beer each day. They jokingly called it liquid bread. Mead, or honey wine, brought a different flavour. Sweet, warm, sometimes infused with herbs to heal or stimulate the spirit. Picture an evening in a monastery. After evening prayers, a few monks gather, pour mead into wooden cups, sipping quietly. The wind whistles through the window, the rough sound of coarse robes shifting, and the scent of honey mingles with lamp smoke. In that moment, despite strict religious discipline, they found a little warmth, a little gentle intoxication, enough to make the darkness outside less frightening. Of course, beer and wine weren't always miracles. Some barrels went bad, grew mold, and caused mass poisoning. And then people whispered of demonic possession or God's punishment. The dark humour here. One moment a monk writes lofty philosophy praising the light of God. The next he's stirring a beer barrel, praying this batch doesn't spoil. The God of Scripture and the God of the monastery cellar were sometimes two very different beings. Beyond monasteries, beer was the glue of community life. In the tavern, everyone sat at the same table, clinking cups, telling stories, arguing, singing. It was where news spread faster than royal decrees. A peasant might sip his beer and whisper he'd seen a witch in the woods. By morning, the entire village believed it. A merchant might boast his new wine was the finest in the region. 3 days later, the rival tavern had counterfeits to compete. Beer didn't just warm stomachs. It fueled every conversation, every rumour, every brawl. At times, beer and wine became political weapons. Lords and powerful clergy hosted lavish feasts, letting the people drink until they cheered them as benefactors. After a few cups of mead, peasants forgot their hardships, raising hands to praise their host. One shrewd lord once said, "If you want to rule in peace, make sure they have beer to drink." And in fact, more than a few uprisings were quelled, not by swords, but by free barrels of ale. What set medieval beer apart from modern beer was its taste and ingredients. Before hops became common, brewers used all kinds of herbs, wormwood, tree bark, even henbane, which once made drinkers swear the hens were calling them to battle. After too many bad trips, hops gradually took over, giving beer a safer, more balanced flavour. But imagine it, a group of peasants drinking henbane beer. then rushing into the fields at midnight, yelling and dancing, a rave party in the 14th century. Meanwhile, nobles preferred wine, the sweeter the better, sometimes spiced with cinnamon or cloves. Red wine warm and heavy, white wine crisp and cool, laid out at feasts alongside roasted meat and bread. But such luxury was mostly reserved for the elite, while common folk stuck to thin beer and homemade mead. The class divide was clear, right in the cup, each person held. Yet whether peasant beer or noble wine, the role remained the same, a way to escape reality. In a world of plague, war, and nature's harshness, one sip of beer or a cup of mead was enough to make people forget. And maybe, just maybe, it was beer and wine that kept medieval society from falling apart. With no painkillers, no coffee, no sleeping pills, beer and wine were the only medicine people had to survive life. Beer and mead may have been the liquid bread that kept medieval people alive, but rye and barley, the grains used to bake actual bread, carried a hidden nightmare, ergot, a tiny fungus that could turn an entire village into a macabre dance floor. Ergot clung to rye as black, hardened lumps. Eat bread made from those grains, and you weren't just filling your stomach. You were swallowing a powerful drug, the ancestor of LSD, and the consequences were far worse than a stomachache. Ergot poisoning had two faces. One, violent convulsions, with bodies shaking, eyes rolling, mouths shouting nonsense. The other, gangrene, as the toxin constricted blood vessels so tightly that fingers, toes, even arms and legs began to rot. Medieval people called it Street Anthony's fire, an invisible blaze burning the body from within. Picture it. A farmer lying on a straw bed, clutching his leg, groaning as if scorched, while his toes turned black. Neighbours whispered, "God is punishing him." But the real culprit was this morning's loaf of bread. The most terrifying moments came when ergot spread through entire harvests. In bad years, rye crops turned mouldy across whole regions. Villagers all ate the same bread, and within days, they began to dance. Not joyful dancing, but a plague of dancing, the infamous dancing mania. Chroniclers describe dozens, even hundreds, gathering in town squares, dancing without pause, drenched in sweat, eyes bulging, laughing or crying, feet bleeding, yet unable to stop. They danced until they collapsed, or died in the street. The most famous outbreak struck Strasbourg in 1518. It began with a woman named Frau Troffea, who danced in the street for days. Others saw her, then joined, as if infected. Soon dozens, then hundreds, were dancing. The authorities panicked, and even hired musicians to help them dance it out, which only killed more people from exhaustion. It was one of the darkest, strangest moments in history. An entire city turned into a deadly nightclub. For medieval minds, there was only one explanation: the devil. They believed the dancers were possessed, enslaved by Satan's rhythm. Priests staged exorcisms, built altars in the streets, prayed for the writhing bodies. But the more they prayed, the more they danced. The madness lasted until the mouldy bread was gone, or the dancers' bodies finally broke down. The dark humour here is hard to miss. Modern science sees ergot as the root of LSD, while medieval villagers saw it as a festival of demons. An involuntary rave, where no one wanted to join, but once you did, you had to dance until your last breath. By today's lens, it was a rave party without DJs or neon lights, just mouldy bread and the beat of war drums echoing through the village. And ergot didn't just make people dance, it left scars in history. Some scholars argue that ergot poisoning played a role in witch hunts, especially in Salem, Massachusetts in the 17th century. Young girls suffering convulsions, screaming, babbling nonsense, all classic ergot symptoms, were seen as possessed. From a few mouldy loaves, the flames of witch trials spread, burning dozens alive. A tiny fungus indirectly helped create one of humanity's darkest chapters. In daily life, ergot cast an invisible curse. Farmers muttered prayers during harvest, begging their rye to stay clean. Bakers inspected every batch of flour, fearing one black speck could kill a family. Even monks weren't safe. A barrel of ergot-tainted beer could turn a pious fast into a communal nightmare. With no microscopes, no concept of microbes, they believed only this: sometimes God laced their food with poison, and survival depended on prayer. What's chilling about ergot is how it blurred the lines between religion, superstition, and science. A priest seeing convulsions thought possession. A village healer watching the dance plague said a ritual to drive away spirits. A modern scientist sees alkaloids constricting blood vessels, hijacking the nervous system. 3 worldviews circling one truth. A single loaf of bread could decide the fate of an entire community. And so, amid the beer mugs, mead cups, and church candles, medieval people lived under an invisible fear that the bread they ate each day, symbol of life, gift of God, might also be the hand of death, dragging them into a dance without end. If ergot turned bread into a curse, then mad honey turned sweetness into a deadly weapon. You might think honey is harmless, golden, smooth, and sweet, but in the mountains around the Black Sea, especially the Pontic Range in northern Turkey, bees fed on rhododendron blossoms, creating honey laced with grey anotoxin. Just a spoonful could turn a tea party into a psychedelic journey, or a funeral. The ancient Greeks knew this well. The historian Xenophon wrote that during a retreat, his soldiers ate honey along the road and collapsed. Men dropped to the ground, eyes rolling, bodies trembling, vomiting. They lay unconscious for hours, and when they woke, they were so weak they couldn't lift their weapons. The dark humour here, no enemy needed, just a few beehives, and an entire army turned into a swarm of groaning, honey-drunk bodies. Dangerous as it was, mad honey was still used by locals, both as medicine and as a high. In small doses it was a heart tonic, lowered blood pressure, even boosted libido. In large doses, it caused hallucinations, nausea, slowed heartbeat, and often death. A two-faced drug, miracle in a healer's hand, executioner in a fool's. In the medieval world, rumours of mad honey spread along trade routes. Merchants brought it as an exotic gift, boasting, "Just one spoonful will let you dream with the gods." Peasants whispered that it let you speak to ancestors or see wandering spirits in graveyards. But there were tragedies too. A family eating honey at supper, then all collapsing, eyes wide, drenched in sweat, dead before anyone understood. Honey, nature's sweetest gift, became a symbol of betrayal, golden on the outside but with a hidden blade. In war, mad honey was even used as biological weapon. The historian Strabo wrote that the Heptacomitai tribe of the Black Sea used poisoned honey to defeat the Romans. They left hives along the road. Exhausted Roman soldiers devoured the honey, then collapsed, helpless. The locals moved in easily, killing or capturing them. No swords, no bloodshed, just bees and flowers. A plan both ruthless and darkly ironic. Imagine a medieval soldier, after a long march, finding a jar of strange honey. He dips his finger, licks it, grins at the sweetness. Half an hour later, his heart pounds erratically, sweat chills his skin, and suddenly he sees his comrades transformed into four-legged beasts dancing around him. Laughter turns to screams, and his body crumples. A scene both tragic and like a black comedy staged by nature itself. Among villagers, mad honey was sometimes seen as a love charm. People believed small doses stirred passion, making the drinker fall into desire. But too much, and the lover didn't swoon. They dropped dead. A fatal aphrodisiac, proof that the line between pleasure and death was just a drop of honey. Monks, too, heard of it during their ascetic journeys. Some records suggest certain monastic orders in the Caucasus tried it in rituals to open visions of God. Incense smoke, Gregorian chants, plus a spoon or two of dark red honey. Suddenly, heaven unfolded in their minds. But some ceremonies ended with monks collapsing, carried outside, while the community whispered it was a test from God, miracle or poisoning. The answer depended on who was holding the pen. What made mad honey especially dangerous was its disguise. Unlike ergot, which left black scars on rye, mad honey looked perfect. Golden, fragrant, indistinguishable from safe honey. It was the perfect hidden killer. You wouldn't know if your honey was normal or mad until your heart slowed, your vision blurred, and the world around you turned into a surreal play. In a society already steeped in superstition, it only deepened the belief that the devil hid in the most familiar things. In the big picture of medieval life, mad honey was a perfect symbol of their common fear. Anything that sustained you could also kill you. Bread carried ergot. beer and mead carried mould. Honey carried forest toxins. And every accident was quickly wrapped in the cloak of the Dakind. Supernatural, curses, spells, Satan's hand. Strip that cloak away, and what remains is a cold truth. People lived in a world where food and medicine were a daily gamble with death. Beyond mad honey, nature's sweet betrayal, the medieval world also had its guides between medicine and witchcraft. The cunning folk, known in villages as healers, midwives, half-sorcerers. They lived on the edge of town, in smoky huts filled with drying herbs and murky jars of potions. They held no titles, no licenses, but to the villagers, they were the only hope when a child burned with fever, when a mother went into labour, when a man doubled over from a bad meal. Picture a winter night, wind howling across the fields, a desperate family pounding on the healer's door. Inside, she's drying mandrake roots and storing jars of dark honey. Their child shakes with fever. She measures out a spoonful of diluted henbane water, forces it down, and hours later, the fever breaks. The child sleeps peacefully. To that family, she is a saviour. But just days later, if another child dies from poisoning, the finger of blame points at her. She may save 10 lives, but one death was enough for whispers to begin. She is a witch. Cunning folk didn't just heal the sick. They made charms, muttered incantations, found lost items, called on the spirits of the dead. A midwife might tie a red string around a baby's wrist to ward off evil. A healer might scatter mandrake powder in a cowshed to guard against the evil eye. To the villagers, these acts were part folk science, part magic. And in a world where everything could be explained by God or the devil, that line was as thin as smoke. The irony is that the church, which claimed a monopoly on prayer, saw such acts as dangerous competition. When a healer cured what the priest could not, the church's authority trembled. So harmless acts, brewing tea from leaves, were branded sorcery. An ointment became proof of a pact with Satan. A bundle of dried herbs became a witch's weapon. And when the pyre was lit, villagers shivered with fear but sighed with relief. The suspicious one was gone. The dark humour here. Those accused of witchcraft were often the ones who knew the most about plants. They knew which leaves reduced fever, which roots eased pain, which berries to avoid. In a world with no official doctors for the poor, they were the only clinic around. But knowledge itself was dangerous. In the Middle Ages, knowing too much could kill you faster than ignorance. Some trials recorded bizarre details. A woman accused simply because a mandrake root was found in her home. She said she used it to make a sleeping aid for her husband's back pain. The court didn't listen. They only heard villagers whisper, "A screaming root, she must be a witch." And so she was dragged to the gallows, charged with flying with demons, all for owning a root even medical texts once listed. In another sense, cunning folk were the first psychologists. They listened to villagers' sorrows, gave a pinch of powder, a blessing, and the belief alone often eased suffering. Faith, not the herb, was the strongest medicine. But that same faith could turn against them. When healing failed, belief became suspicion, suspicion became accusation. Children were especially caught in this spiral. Families often believed a child's sickness was caused by witches, and the nearest healer became the perfect scapegoat. Records tell of children taught to avoid the huts of forest hags, warned, "They'll steal your soul with their ointments." In reality, those old women were often the very ones who had saved countless children before. But collective fear rarely bows to reason, and gender played its part. Male healers were often respected as folk doctors. Women doing the same were far more likely to be called witches. Gender wasn't just biology, it was a sentence. And in the flames that consumed women, you can see shadows of fear, jealousy, and the cruelty of patriarchy. In taverns, witch rumours spread faster than beer. A drunk might swear he saw a healer flying on a broom over rooftops. By morning, the whole village believed it. A child might say he saw the midwife muttering at the well. By the next day, it was evidence that she cursed the water. Stories spread, twisted, and hardened into collective truth. And once collective truth was strong enough, no evidence was needed, only fire. So when you look at the image of the witch in old drawings, the pointy hat, the cauldron, the broom, remember, at its root, it was often just a poor peasant woman, holding herbs and a pot of tea. What hanged her was not sorcery, but knowledge, and the fact that she was different. Among all the stories of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, flying ointments, incense smoke, beer, ergot, mad honey, and folk healers, one truth stands out. How people viewed intoxicating substances in the Middle Ages never depended only on the substances themselves, but on the eyes of society. A leaf, a root, a drop of liquid could be medicine, poison, miracle, or Satan's mark. The difference wasn't chemistry, it was context, who used it, where, and under what label. In the world of medicine, herbs were tools to save lives. Physicians, whether trained in Bologna or taught by their fathers, tried to classify, record, and experiment. For them, henbane eased pain, mandrake served as anesthesia. Belladonna calmed spasms. They measured doses, scribbled notes in leather-bound books, illustrated with crude drawings. Many of those formulas laid foundations for later pharmacology. But here's the paradox. That very knowledge made them look like fire dancers. One patient dead, one odd symptom, and the physician could be branded an accomplice of the devil. Medicine in the Middle Ages was walking a tightrope, one step saving lives, the next step falling into suspicion. In the world of religion, the same effects were dressed in holiness. Incense smoke making worshippers faint? That was a vision of God. A monk delirious from fasting and smoke? That was grace. But if a village healer fainted after applying ointment? That was possession. The dark humor here, the same neurological effect, but in the church it was a miracle. In the field it was witchcraft. The medieval church held the power to define reality. They decided what was sacred and what was heresy, and that power outweighed any scientific reasoning. In the eyes of the Inquisition, everything could be turned into evidence. A jar of strange honey, poison, a mandrake root shaped like a human, proof of a pact with the devil, a vial of belladonna, flying ointment. No need for tests, no science, just a villager whispering, "I saw her muttering in the woods," and the pyre was ready to burn. In that atmosphere, knowledge became a sin, curiosity became a death sentence. For ordinary people, though, things were simpler. They didn't care what alkaloid was in mandrake, or how many compounds ergot contained. They only knew. When the child had fever, the healer could help. When the husband had stomach pains, the folk doctor could cure. When weak beer was safer than well water. For them, herbs, wine, resin weren't sorcery or science. They were just part of daily life, like garlic hanging on the door to ward off evil. Some even believed hallucinations weren't errors of the senses, but glimpses through the veil of this world into the next. It was this layering that created the paradox of medieval society. A monk could write in his journal, "I saw an angel in the incense smoke." A healer could recall, "Mandrake helped the child sleep." A merchant could say, "Mad honey, let me speak with my ancestors." But when these stories collided, the outcome wasn't understanding. It was suspicion, fear, and bloodshed. From today's perspective, it's easy to smirk at such naivety. But imagine living in that time. No painkillers, no antibiotics, no electricity, no science to explain. Every root, every puff of smoke, every spoonful of honey carried the potential to be divine or demonic. You had no choice but to believe. Believe it was a blessing, or believe it was a trap, and that belief could save you or kill you. So, the intoxicants of the Middle Ages weren't just about biochemistry. They were about meaning. In the physician's hands, they were medicine. In the monk's hands, they were miracles. In the healer's hands, they were witchcraft. And in the peasant's hands, they were simply part of a meal, a mug of beer, the daily grind of survival. From the thin beers that kept whole villages alive, to the screaming roots of mandrake in legend, from the deadly glittering eyes of belladonna to the mass hysteria of the dancing plague, from golden honey turned into a weapon of war to incense smoke lifting entire congregations, into visions. Our journey through the intoxicants of the Middle Ages comes to an end. And as you can see, what they had and what they used wasn't so different from us today. Medieval people had no sleeping pills. They had henbane. No anesthetics. They had mandrake. No modern cosmetics. They had belladonna. No tranquilizers. They had beer. No therapy sessions. They had a healer's words and jars of foul-smelling herbs. And when they looked upward, searching for something beyond their brutal world, they found incense, smoke, visions, angels, or demons, all in the same breath. The point isn't the biology, it's the meaning people gave to it. A drop of sap could become curse or miracle, depending on who held it. A human-shaped root could be anesthesia or evidence of sorcery, depending on who told the story. The same phenomenon could be, in the eyes of monks, a blessing. In the eyes of judges, a crime. In the eyes of peasants, survival. The story of intoxicants in the Middle Ages is less about herbs than about how people faced the uncertainty of life. If there's a lesson in this journey, it's that people hundreds of years ago were just like us, afraid, curious, desperate, and longing for a way to forget suffering. When you sip morning coffee to wake up, or lift a glass of wine to relax, you're doing the same thing as a medieval peasant with his weak beer, or a healer sprinkling mandrake into a potion. Same drive. To find a fragile balance between pain and joy, between harsh reality and gentle illusion. And maybe that's what makes them feel close to us. In an age of death and darkness, they still found ways to get drunk, to dream, to laugh, to momentarily forget hunger, cold, and mortality. Intoxicants, dangerous as they were, even when they led to the stake, were fragile bridges to hope, to belief in a better world. So when we look back, don't just see witches, demons, and suspicion. See the courage, the creativity, the survival instinct of our ancestors. They didn't have modern science, but they had curiosity. They didn't have advanced medicine, but they had faith. And that was enough to carry them through centuries we today can hardly imagine. Maybe right now, you're sitting with a coffee, your laptop glowing, hearing these stories. But take a deep breath. Picture yourself in a medieval wooden hut, with candles flickering, wind howling through cracks, and the sharp smell of drying herbs in the air. In that moment, you're no longer just an audience, but a witness to a world where one sip of beer could save your life, one drop of medicine could open heaven's gates, and one mistake could send you to the pyre. That is the allure of history, both alien and familiar, frightening, yet intimate. And if this story makes you smile, shiver, or fall silent in thought, then perhaps, somewhere, those medieval figures, the healer, the monk, the peasant, the soldier, are still whispering to you through smoke, through ale, through their small fears and fragile joys. In the ancient world, there were no railroads, no highways, and even walking through the forest was often more dangerous than going into battle. So how did people, goods, armies, and even stories move around? The answer is surprisingly simple. The sea. In antiquity, the sea wasn't a void dividing continents. It was the road, the bloodstream, the pounding heart of every empire. Whoever ruled the sea, ruled the world. Whoever lost the sea would soon lose everything. The Egyptians understood this when their wooden boats floated down the Nile and out into the Mediterranean. The Greeks understood this when they turned mountain barriers into stepping stones to the waves. And the Phoenicians, the immortal merchants of the sea, turned every wave into a coin, every gust of wind into an opportunity. Look at an ancient map, and you'll see. The sea wasn't the periphery. It was the stage itself. Step onto an Athenian trireme. You hear the oars slamming into the water in unison, like metallic drums beating in the belly of the sea. 3 levels of oars, 200 men pulling, sweat dripping into the salt spray. That ship was the guided missile of the ancient world, not powered by oil, not by electricity, but by muscle and discipline. Each rower was a tiny cog, but together they drove the ship forward like a giant wooden spear ready to smash an enemy hull. Once you've heard the crack of splintering wood, the spray of seawater, and the screams of sailors thrown overboard, you'll understand why the ancients believed Poseidon, god of the sea, was as terrifying as Ares, god of war. And the sea didn't just bring war, it was the road of knowledge. Remember, the Phoenician alphabet, the foundation of Greek, Roman, and even the alphabet we use today, wasn't carried on camel caravans, but on merchant ships. Every letter on the page you're reading once crossed the waves. The dark humour here is this. It wasn't philosophers in libraries who spread literacy across the world, but greedy merchants on ships loaded with cedar wood and glass. In other words, it was greed that taught humanity to read faster than any lofty philosophy. The sea was also a gateway to both wealth and death. The Silk Road across land sounds romantic, but compare it to ships packed with wine, olive oil, and grain sailing from Egypt and Greece to Spain. Faster, more profitable, far more impactful. Whoever controlled the ports controlled the lifeblood of the economy. Alexandria wasn't just a city, it was the power socket of the entire Mediterranean. Touch it, and you tapped into the whole system. But because of that, blood was spilled on the docks, and naval battles erupted without end. Here's the fascinating part. People both feared and loved the sea. It fed them, but it drowned them. In the morning, a merchant ship might sail proudly, sails full of wind, holds bursting with goods. By nightfall, only a few planks washed ashore, sailors' corpses floating in the tide. To the ancients, the sea was both the road to prosperity and a black hole that swallowed without warning. No wonder every great Mediterranean civilization had terrifying sea legends. The monster Scylla, the whirlpool Charybdis, or the sirens whose songs led to death. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were warnings. Never think you're stronger than the sea. Maybe the easiest way to grasp the sea's importance in the ancient world is this. Today, when you look up and see airplanes and satellites, that's what ships were to the ancients. Each sail on the horizon was cutting-edge tech, national pride. A fleet wasn't just wood and canvas. It was a symbol of power, a declaration of faith that we can reach beyond our world. If we had to crown the very first international shipping company in human history, that title would undoubtedly belong to the Phoenicians. They weren't a mighty empire with iron legions, nor did they have legendary pharaohs like Egypt or Babylon. All they had was the sea, and they turned it into a giant money-printing machine. The Phoenicians were born merchants, men who seemed to come into the world already knowing how to tie ropes, raise sails, and navigate by the stars. From small ports like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, they wove a trade network across the Mediterranean so enduring that their name still echoes today. Phoenician ships weren't massive war machines like Athens's triremes. They were the container ships of the ancient world. They carried cedar wood from Lebanon's forests, Tyrian purple cloth, a dye so rare and costly only kings could wear it, and the very first glass objects the world had ever seen. They traded everything: metals, wine, oil, ivory, even slaves. The dark humor here is this. The only thing the Phoenicians didn't sell was their own lives. They needed those to row their ships tomorrow. Picture a Phoenician harbor, ships docking, oars lifted, cargo piled high like mountains. The smell of resin from cedar wood mixes with the scent of fish, spilled wine, and the shouting of merchants in every tongue. In one corner, a dyer stirs cloth in a stew of shellfish extract, producing the sacred Tyrian purple. The whole port reeks, pungent, sharp, fishy, but to the Phoenicians, that was the smell of money. And it wasn't just goods they traded, they spread writing itself. The Phoenician alphabet, simple, easy to learn, easy to use, spread by sea, to Greece, to Rome, and from there to us today. If you're typing letters on your screen right now, remember, the ancestors of those characters were once scratched onto ship planks, recording debts between two Phoenician merchants. Dark humor again. The writing system we now use for poetry, philosophy, and love. Songs originally existed to make sure Merchant A owed Merchant B this many jars of wine and that many logs of cedar. Their city of Tyre was once called the Pearl of the Sea, a floating fortress so wealthy that even Alexander the Great needed 7 months to conquer it. Carthage, their colony in North Africa, grew into a power strong enough to challenge Rome itself. From a narrow strip of land, the Phoenicians planted seeds across the Mediterranean, building an empire without borders, the empire of trade. No one remembers the names of individual Phoenician kings, but everyone remembers the ships with crimson-purple sails cutting across the sunlit waves. What made Phoenicia immortal wasn't armies, but the memory of the sea. Each voyage was a thread woven into the great fabric called the Mediterranean. They didn't conquer with swords, they conquered with contracts and coin. If Athens bragged about its triremes, if Rome boasted of its legions, Phoenicia simply held up its accounting books. And sometimes, a ledger is more terrifying than a sword, because it binds you longer than a wound ever could. But Phoenician trade was also stained with blood. Slaves, spoils, journeys that never returned. A single storm could sink fortunes, a band of pirates could seize an entire ship, and when Rome rose, Carthage, Phoenicia's brightest jewel, became an enemy to be destroyed. The end of Carthage after the Third Punic War, burned to the ground, its soil salted so nothing would grow again, was proof of how fragile a sea empire could be. Yet even after Carthage fell, Phoenicia's legacy lived on. Tyrian purple became a symbol of power. Their alphabet became the tool through which the world wrote its history. And the image of curved hulled ships with billowing sails, loaded with goods and stories, remained carved into humanity's memory. The Phoenicians may be gone, but the sea never forgets those who knew how to turn its storms into profit. Athens didn't have endless cedar forests like Phoenicia, nor fertile plains like Egypt. What they had were rocky mountains, barren soil, and a wide bay, and they turned the one thing they did have, the sea, into a weapon. The trireme, the three-tiered oared warship, was the beating heart of Athens, the wooden war machine that allowed a small city to challenge the vast Persian Empire. Picture a trireme cutting through the waves. Long hull, bronze-tipped prow, white sail billowing in the wind. But its soul lay in more than 170 oars. 3 stacked levels, like an ancient industrial engine. Every oar an arm, every stroke a heartbeat. When the drumbeat sounded, hundreds of men pulled together, and the ship surged forward at a speed that even cavalry would envy. The dark humour here, the most advanced weapon of its age, was powered by nothing more than watery porridge and slave sweat. The trireme didn't fire arrows, didn't have cannons. It attacked by ramming. Its sharp bronze prow smashed into the enemy's hull. Wood splintered. Water rushed in. Screams erupted across the sea. Naval battles weren't fought at a distance. They were massive collisions between wooden beasts, each crash a death sentence for dozens of sailors. And in this terrifying art, Athens was the master. The best example, the Battle of Salamis, 480 BCE. Persia's Xerxes brought thousands of ships, a fleet so vast it covered the horizon. Athens, with just a few hundred triremes, stood in despair. But they had what Persia didn't, home waters and bold strategy. Themistocles, the genius commander, lured Xerxes' armada into the narrow straits of Salamis. There, numbers became a burden. Persian ships, huge and crowded, could barely maneuver, crashing into each other. Athenian triremes, smaller and swifter, darted through like sharks in a cage. When the drums thundered, hundreds of oars slapped the sea, bronze prows lunged forward, and the water turned into a slaughterhouse. They say Xerxes watched it all from his golden throne on shore, his mighty fleet shredded into driftwood before his eyes. Thousands drowned, the air filled with screams and splintering wood. Athens, a tiny city, stocked the greatest empire in the world with nothing but timber and muscle. Dark humour. It was a glorious victory, but also proof that if you buy a VIP seat to watch the war, you might just see your billion-drachma shipping company sink in one afternoon. Salamis wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point. It saved Athenian democracy from annihilation and opened the road to the golden age of Greece, when philosophers, artists, and playwrights could breathe free. If we talk today about Socrates, Pericles, or the Parthenon, behind it all is the thunder of unseen oars, the hands of nameless men who rowed themselves to exhaustion on wooden triremes. But the trireme was also the symbol of the price Athens paid. Keeping a massive fleet afloat required money, and that money came from their allies that Athens slowly turned into subjects. Contributions became tributes, and Athens transformed from protector into oppressor. The trireme was both the shield that saved the city and the shackle that bound its allies. And as arrogance swelled, Athenian triremes no longer turned their bronze prows only against foreign invaders, but also against those who once called them friends. Athens staked its entire destiny on ships of wood, and for decades they won. But the trireme was like a hungry beast. It needed war to survive. Every voyage demanded more grain, more silver, more blood. And when the sea no longer offered enemies abroad, Athens found one at home in the Mediterranean, Sparta. Thus began the Peloponnesian War, a tragedy that dragged on for decades. While Athens built its power on wood and sails, Sparta treated the sea as something alien, almost an insult to their warrior spirit. To Sparta, true strength came from feet, planted firmly on the ground, from the unbreakable phalanx, from the glint of a spear on the battlefield. Waves, in their eyes, meant nothing compared to the soil they had trained on since childhood with blood, sweat, and the lash. Spartans were taught how to hold the line, not how to row a boat while seasick. The dark humor here is this. Spartan soldiers could face a rain of arrows without blinking, but would vomit the moment they set foot on a deck. This mighty empire was practically blind to the sea, and while Athens roamed the Mediterranean with its triremes, Sparta remained stuck with farmland and its land army. But then came the Peloponnesian War. Athens brought its fleet, blockaded the coasts, cut off Sparta's grain, and left them choking. This was the moment when the proud warriors of the land were forced to learn a skill they had once despised: seafaring. At first it was almost comical. Legendary warriors fumbling with oars, their hands trembling because they were used to spears, not rowing. Spartan ships crawled clumsily, like an ox trying to swim. But when survival was on the line, change was inevitable. Sparta turned to Persia, the old enemy of all Greece, for money and naval expertise. Yes, the same warriors who once shouted freedom for Greece were now shaking hands with the foreigner, as long as it meant crushing Athens. And so, with Persian gold and Spartan grit, a fleet was born. It wasn't as refined as Athenian triremes, but it was strong enough to break the blockade, strong enough for revenge. When Sparta's navy finally reached full power, the balance of the war shifted. The Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE made it clear. Athens' entire fleet, the same fleet that once humbled Persia, was annihilated. In one afternoon, the triremes that had terrified the seas were reduced to floating splinters. Athens, once master of the waves, was brought to its knees, and it all began because Sparta, despite hating the sea, finally learned to ride it. But the truth is, Sparta never loved the sea. They learned to sail not out of ambition to rule the waves, but simply to destroy Athens. After their victory, they didn't build a lasting naval empire. Spartan ships rotted, sailors dispersed, and the sea once again became someone else's playground. Sparta returned to what it knew: farmland, soldiers, and brutal training. And that was Sparta's tragedy. They beat Athens at sea, but only as a temporary borrower of someone else's weapon. When the war was done, they gave the sea back to fate. With no trade, no network of ports, no lasting fleet, Sparta had only land and blood. And in a world where the sea was becoming the lifeblood of power, scorning it was the same as signing their own death sentence. Carthage, the jewel of Phoenicia in North Africa, was once the unchallenged capital of the seas. If Athens had the trireme, Carthage had the quinquereme. 5-tiered oared giants, bigger, heavier, more brutal. Each quinquereme was like a floating wooden fortress, its bronze prow gleaming, hundreds of oars roaring in unison. They didn't just guard Carthage's wealthy trade routes, they were an invisible wall blocking anyone who dared enter Carthage's private pool, the Western Mediterranean. Rome at first was nothing on the water, a landlocked city-state, famous for its disciplined legions but with no naval tradition. Facing Carthage, the Romans were like men who had just learned to swim and were suddenly thrown into the ocean. But Carthage underestimated one thing: Rome didn't need tradition. Rome only needed to copy fast and copy well. When the Romans captured a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme, they didn't burn it. They measured every detail, copied it, and built an entire fleet from the model. Dark humor. While Carthage had spent centuries perfecting the design, Rome needed only a few months of reverse engineering to mass-produce their own. Just like that, a land power suddenly had a massive navy. But Rome knew they couldn't beat Carthage at Carthage's own game. The Romans didn't have skilled rowers or the expertise for ramming tactics, so they invented the corvus, an iron boarding bridge with a spike. When two ships collided, the corvus dropped, hooked onto the enemy deck, and turned naval combat into land combat on wood. It was a stroke of genius. Rome transformed the sea into solid ground, where their legions thrived. Carthaginians laughed at the idea of infantry trying to fight at sea, until they found themselves sword-fighting Romans on the decks of their own quinqueremes. The Punic Wars erupted like a drawn-out nightmare. The Mediterranean became a graveyard of ships. Thousands of quinqueremes and corvus-fitted vessels rammed, burned, and sank. They say the waters around Sicily turned red with blood, bodies floating so thick that even dolphins stayed away. It was a horrifying reminder that ultimate power in the Mediterranean no longer belonged to merchants, but to whoever could spill the most blood into the sea. Carthage didn't go down easily. They struck back with Hannibal, the military genius who marched through the Alps with elephants. But in the end, the sea sealed their fate. Rome cut supply lines, severed Carthage from its colonies, and left the once mighty naval power stranded. The Third Punic War ended in bloody tragedy. Carthage burned to the ground, survivors sold into slavery, its soil salted so nothing would ever grow again. The dark humour of history lies right there. Carthage, once the master of the sea, died of thirst beside it. Rome, once a people who couldn't even swim, became the owners of the Mediterranean. From then on, Mare Nostrum, our sea, was no longer an empty boast, but a reality. When Carthage lay in ashes and Rome swaggered as the new master of the waves, one might think the sea was nothing but a stage for war, blood, and the blare of bronze horns. But tucked between the stinking harbours of fish and charred pine resin, there was one place that turned the sea into a gateway to a different kind of treasure: knowledge. That place was Alexandria, Egypt's great harbour, the lighthouse of civilization that lit up the ancient world. Alexandria wasn't just where ships docked, it was where humanity moored its dreams. A city founded by Alexander the Great, and perhaps his greatest legacy wasn't conquest, but learning. Picture yourself at the docks of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. The sea is crowded with ships, Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, Indian, even vessels from far down the Red Sea. On deck, goods pile high. Pungent spices, papyrus, gold, ivory, stone statues, slaves, and barrels of wine. But the most precious cargo wasn't material at all. It was scrolls. Alexandria had an unwritten law. Any ship docking in port had to surrender its books, manuscripts, or papyri, whether personal or commercial. They were copied, the originals kept in the Library of Alexandria, and only the copies returned. The dark humour? Many sailors could lose their gold without a tear, but weep in fury if their original texts were taken. For Alexandria, knowledge wasn't cargo to be returned. It was a national treasure, and borrowing knowledge was basically state-sanctioned piracy. The Library of Alexandria, by legend, held hundreds of thousands of scrolls: Greek philosophy, Egyptian medicine, Babylonian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Phoenician maps, all stored on wooden shelves under flickering lamplight, where frail scholars bent over papyri. For the first time in history, the knowledge of the world was gathered in one place, not just preserved, but fused together, sparking new discoveries. Alexandria became a meeting point of minds. Euclid wrote his Elements here. Herophilos dissected corpses to understand medicine, and even Archimedes in Syracuse felt intellectual ripples. But Alexandria wasn't only about books. It had the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Nearly 140 meters tall, it towered like a pillar connecting sea and sky. By day, bronze mirrors reflected sunlight far across the horizon. By night, fire blazed as a beacon for ships. It wasn't just engineering, it was a symbol. The sea was no longer only danger, but now had a street light. If you were a lost sailor in the night, seeing the Pharos must have felt like glimpsing heaven. If you were a merchant, that light was a promise your cargo, or your papyrus love letter, would reach its destination. In that atmosphere, Alexandria turned the sea into a corridor of knowledge. Every ship docking didn't just bring wood and wine. It brought ideas, formulas, stories. Alexandria didn't produce everything, but it gathered everything, like a giant brain controlling the body of the Mediterranean. If Carthage was the economic heart, Alexandria was the cultural brain. Yet, like everything tied to the sea, Alexandria's light had its shadows. The library burned, partly when Caesar besieged the city, partly later under Arab conquest. No one knows exactly how much was lost. Hundreds of thousands of texts, maybe entire civilizations' worth of knowledge. Some joke, if those books hadn't burned, we'd have had Wi-Fi in the 2nd century. Dark humour, but bitter truth. Alexandria's fall was like a massive shipwreck of knowledge, and humanity only salvaged a few floating planks. What matters is that Alexandria proved the sea didn't just feed economies or wars, it fed knowledge. Thanks to this harbour, Greek math met Egyptian medicine, Babylonian astronomy met Indian philosophy. Here, the world learned to remember, not just by oral tradition, but by written text, maps, and numbers. Without Alexandria, much might have been lost forever in remote fishing villages, and without the sea carrying manuscripts, here, Alexandria would have been just another desert town. Picture a day in the library, a young scholar bent over a papyrus scroll, charting the stars. Outside, the sound of waves, ships docking, merchants shouting over spice prices. In that moment, sea and knowledge intertwined. A wave brought salt, a scroll brought ideas, and from that meeting, humanity stepped forward. Alexandria also reminds us that knowledge is never separate from power. The Ptolemies built the library not out of pure love of books, but to make Egypt the center of the world. Whoever controlled knowledge controlled power. Carthage's fleet once terrified the seas, but was reduced to ashes. Meanwhile, the papyrus scrolls of Alexandria, though many were lost, still planted seeds for the future. The power of the sword might vanish in a century. The power of knowledge echoes for millennia. And perhaps that's the beautiful paradox of naval history. The sea was both a graveyard of warships and a highway of ideas. Alexandria, with its library and its lighthouse, was proof that the sea didn't just demand blood, it could also return light. And while the warriors and generals turned to dust, that light still flickers, guiding the world through the dark. The sea lifted empires up, but the sea also drowned them. The harsh truth of history is this: whoever depends on naval power will, sooner or later, die by it. Not because the ships are weak, but because people are. Keeping dominance at sea is a race with no finish line, an endless hunger devouring silver, timber, and blood. The moment an empire stops feeding it, that empire becomes prey. Athens was the first example. They beat Persia with triremes, ruled the Mediterranean with their fleet, but that same fleet turned them into tyrants over their allies. The Delian League, born as a pact against invaders, quickly became a cash cow for Athens to siphon off and build the Parthenon and keep hundreds of ships afloat. Allies stopped being friends and became cattle to be milked. When Sparta and the other city-states rose up, Athens still had its mighty fleet but had lost trust. And when the disaster at Aegospotami struck, the entire Athenian fleet was destroyed in a single afternoon, and the city's fate collapsed with it. A democracy that once boasted of freedom was crushed by its own navy, the very ships that had saved them from Persia now floating as coffins. From that day, Athens never shone again. Carthage followed the same path. The sea was once their crown jewel, Quinqueremes, the nightmare of every merchant. But when Rome decided to build a fleet, Carthage learned the hard way. Power at sea isn't just technique, it's endurance. Rome could lose dozens of ships in storms, then turn around and build hundreds more. Carthage, wealthy but arrogant, didn't grasp that the sea rewards stubborn grit, not delicate skill. Their end was so brutal that it became legend. The queen of the Mediterranean burned to the ground, its soil salted so nothing would grow again. In those ashes, the sound of Quinquereme oars fell silent forever. Even Rome, shouting, "Mare nostrum, the sea is ours," could not escape. At their height, Roman fleets controlled every port, every route from Spain to Syria. But maintaining that network drained silver non-stop, feeding a colossal machine. When corruption spread, when emperors wasted wealth on luxury, the treasury bled dry and the fleets rotted into useless wood. Pirates from Cilicia prowled so freely that merchant ships refused to sail. Rome suffered the humiliation of hiring protection services for grain shipments from Egypt, or the entire capital would starve. The dark humour, the same people who once owned the world, now had to pay extortion money to smelly pirates. And when bigger storms came, Rome's navy couldn't hold. Goths, Vandals, Byzantines, Arabs, each used the sea as a dagger stabbing Rome's exposed belly. The Vandals, a tribe, once mocked as barbarians, delivered the killing blow by building ships and raiding right into Carthage, then Rome itself. The irony? The empire that had buried Carthage was now destroyed by Carthage's descendants, striking from the sea. The sea is loyal to no one. It gives power, and it takes it back without reason, only with its brutal law. Whoever rose weakly sinks. Alexandria didn't escape either. Once a harbour of knowledge, once lit by the great Pharos lighthouse, when the Ptolemies faded, Alexandria became prey. Caesar, Augustus, later conquerors, each treated the harbour not as a beacon of learning, but as loot. The Library of Alexandria, symbol of sea and knowledge united, was devoured by fire. When the light went out, Alexandria fell from the capital of wisdom to just another dusty port. Here lies the cruel paradox. Navies were the ultimate weapon, but to sustain them, empires became their prisoners. Athens drained allies dry to feed triremes. Rome emptied its treasury to build quinqueremes. Carthage bled itself to defend trade routes. Each ship was a shining trophy and a crushing debt. When economies faltered, when discipline cracked, when trust collapsed, the sea instantly demanded repayment. No empire could stand forever on the waves. The ancients knew this better than anyone. In collective tragedies, they saw the sea as both friend and traitor. One day, it fed them fish, trade, and victory. The next, it threw storms, sank fleets, and drowned dreams. Poseidon, with his trident, didn't need to march to war. He could annihilate an empire with one accidental storm. And humanity, no matter how clever, could never command the sea. At best, they begged it to stay friendly for a while. Seen in this tragic light, ancient naval power wasn't just about ships or strategy. It was the drama of dependence. The higher you rose on the waves, the harder the sea could crush you. Athens, Carthage, Rome, all followed the same life cycle. The sea built them, the sea buried them. And behind every wrecked hull, every abandoned harbour, you can almost hear the dry laughter of fate. No one rules the sea forever. The sea has no loyalty, but it leaves behind legacies that never fade. Wooden ships have rotted, fleets that once terrified the world have turned to ashes, yet the lessons they left still sail with us today. If Phoenicia hadn't woven its trade routes across the Mediterranean, would the alphabet have spread far enough to become the foundation of modern civilization? If Athens hadn't built its trireme fleet, would young democracy have survived the crushing weight of Persia? If Carthage hadn't shown off the quinquereme, would Rome have ever learned how to build a navy and turn the Mediterranean into Mare Nostrum? And if Alexandria hadn't gathered the knowledge of the world, would humanity have entered its renaissances with enough tools to move forward? The sea tested humanity with wind, waves, and storms, but it also gave them wings to rise beyond their limits. That legacy isn't only in victories and defeats, but in the very images burned into memory. The curved prow of a Phoenician ship, the pounding oars of an Athenian trireme, the bronze ram of a Carthaginian quinquereme, the endless light of the Pharos lighthouse. Those symbols, even when buried, still live in the imagination of humankind. Look at a modern steel warship today, and you'll still glimpse their shadows. The only difference is engines instead of muscles, radar instead of stars, and missiles instead of oars. But the rule hasn't changed. Whoever controls the sea shapes the world. Here's the great irony. While warriors, generals, and kings have turned to dust, the most lasting legacy they left wasn't statues. It was seafaring techniques, nautical charts, and the knowledge passed from one sailor to the next. A Greek sailor may have drowned 2,000 years ago, but the way he tied a rope, the way he read the wind, the way he steered through a storm still echoes in every book on navigation. That is the kind of immortality the sea grants, not in bone, but in memory carried by waves. And the sea gave humanity humility. Every empire that thought it ruled the sea eventually got swept away. Athens was humbled by Sparta, Carthage erased by Rome, Rome humiliated by pirates and barbarians, Alexandria burned to dust. Yet after every collapse, people stood up, raised sails, and challenged the sea again. The sea may be a traitor, but it's also the greatest teacher. It reminds us that power is never permanent, that wisdom matters more than strength, and that every generation must relearn the lesson of living with the waves. The sea's eternal legacy also lives in how we see the world today. Modern trade routes, massive steel navies, bustling ports, they are direct descendants of Phoenicia, Athens, Carthage, Rome, and Alexandria. Today's global shipping giants are no different from the Phoenician traders of old, except with diesel engines instead of sails. Modern naval standoffs in the South China Sea or the Atlantic are just new versions of the Punic Wars, only with aircraft carriers instead of quinqueremes. And the light of the Pharos lighthouse still shines only now in the form of beacons, radar, and satellites. History never dies, it just changes its skin. We might scoff at the ancients for praying to Poseidon before every voyage. But even now, with GPS satellites and cutting-edge radar, a single storm can still sink a ship. A single oil spill can still poison an ocean. The sea never truly belongs to us. It only lets us ride on its back for a while, before reminding us who the real master island. That's the eternal lesson the ancient empires left us, and one we're still learning every day. When we close this story, we see that the sea wasn't just the foundation of ancient navies, it was a mirror of human fate. In the sound of waves, you can hear ambition, pride, fear, and tragedy. The sea nurtured civilization, gave us roots, opportunities, and connections, but it also demanded blood, sweat, and tears in return. Every ship that set sail was also a prayer whispered into the infinite. If you look back at this journey like a long movie, you'll see the characters enter and exit the stage. Phoenicia with its greedy traders, Athens with its proud triremes, Sparta stubborn but stumbling, Carthage rich but tragic, Rome ruthless then broken, Alexandria brilliant, then burned. They all came and went, but the real character, the only one that stayed from beginning to end, was the sea. It never left the screen, only changed its role. Sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, sometimes friend, sometimes enemy. Like an immortal actor, it continues to play the lead in our story today. And maybe what makes this story hit so close is not its distance, but its familiarity. Every time you board a ferry, a ship, or a flight across the ocean, you're traveling on roads first opened by the Phoenicians. Every time you look at a world map, you're seeing the legacy of sailors who once sketched coastlines with sweat and blood. Every time you hear news of naval conflicts, you're watching a new chapter of Athens versus Sparta, Carthage versus Rome. History doesn't repeat, but it casts shadows on the present, reminding us we're not separate, just continuations. And beyond that, the sea is also a symbol of freedom and longing. Ancient sailors set out not only for gold or victory, but for the dream of seeing a wider world. The sea gave them a reason to leave their villages, to imagine faraway lands, to believe there was more out there, and because of that, human civilization didn't suffocate in narrowness. The sea was both challenge and promise. It whispered, if you dare to sail, you might lose everything or find the one thing that makes you immortal. So when we close this chapter, we can smile at a simple truth. The world has changed, but the sea hasn't. The waves are still white-crested, the wind still fills sails, the creak of wood still echoes in the sound of surf. Only now, instead of triremes and quinqueremes, we have container ships, nuclear submarines, and aircraft carriers. But in the roar of engines, if you listen closely, you can still hear the oars of Athens, the iron hooks of Rome's Corvus, and the wind around the Pharos lighthouse. The sea gave humanity its legacy, and by continuing to set sail, we keep that legacy alive. If you were an ancient king, what would you fear the most? Enemy armies? Plagues? Betrayal? No, the thing to fear most was a newborn child. That was the obsession of Astyages, the aging king of the Medes, when astrologers warned him a child of Persian blood would grow up and overthrow his throne. And in a world where prophecy weighed like stone, no one dared to laugh it off. So the moment his grandson let out his first cry, Astyages shivered as though he'd heard his own death knell. That child's name was Cyrus. The story begins with a dream. They say Astyages dreamed his daughter Mandane urinated a river so vast it flooded the land. The seers explained, the son she bears will rule all of Asia. To any normal grandfather, this might sound like a blessing, but to a king chained to his throne, it was a death sentence written in the stars. And so, when Mandane gave birth to Cyrus, Astyages ordered the baby killed. A court official was tasked with carrying out the deed. But like every epic tale, death hesitated for the sake of drama. Instead of killing the boy, the official handed him to a shepherd's family on the edge of the desert, hoping to obey the order while sparing his own conscience the blood of an infant. The dark humour here? The most powerful king in the region had just entrusted his fate to a herdsman and a makeshift cradle of sheepskin. Cyrus grew up among barren hills, not in gilded palaces but in a smoky hut. No silk, blankets only straw, no tutors only stones to throw and goats to herd. But that harsh upbringing sharpened his eyes like a hawk's, toughened his hands like leather, and forged a spirit that refused to bow. By the time he was 10, Cyrus was already playing king with village boys. When one refused to obey, he ordered punishment, and the boy ran home crying to his father. That father happened to be a noble who complained to Astyages. Curious, the king summoned the child. And when Astyages looked into the boy's face, he realized his grandson was still alive. That moment was a dagger turned inward. The child he had condemned now stood before him strong, clever, regal. But instead of striking him down, Astyages hesitated. Perhaps it was blood ties. Perhaps it was fear that prophecy could not be outrun. He chose to spare Cyrus and sent him back to Persia to live with his true parents. The dark humour. Astyages may have thought mercy would soften the prophecy, but in truth, he was just signing his own death warrant, with a delayed execution date. Back in Persia, Cyrus carried both the hardness of the desert and the authority of royal blood. The Persians at the time were just a minor tribe under Median rule. But in their eyes, Cyrus wasn't ordinary. He was chosen by the gods, a seed of destiny. And as with every great tale, from a shepherd boy would rise a king. Looking back, the tragedy of Astyages is clear. He believed the prophecy so much that his attempt to kill his grandson made it come true. Had Cyrus been raised in a palace, he might have grown into a loyal prince. But by casting him out, Astyages hardened him into the leader Persians longed for. Sometimes in history, fear itself summons fate faster. And in the dry winds of the desert, the abandoned child began to hear the whisper of a throne. When Cyrus returned to Persia, he was no longer the abandoned child of the desert, but a young man carrying both the aura of destiny and the grit of a shepherd. The Persians, long forced to bow before the Median king, now began to see in Cyrus a flicker of hope. This was no longer a child's game of playing king, but a collective dream that Persia could finally take control of its own fate. Astyages, the old king, was not blind. He heard the whispers rising from Persia, heard Cyrus's name spreading louder and louder as someone who could rally hearts. The old prophecy haunted him again, this time not as a nightmare, but as a growing shadow before his eyes. So he chose to strike first. He moved his generals and his armies, ordering the capture of Cyrus, the rebellious grandson, the dark humour of history. The king who once failed to kill a baby in a cradle now had to mobilize an entire army to hunt that same boy on the battlefield. But Cyrus was no helpless child anymore. He had learned to unite the Persians with something Media never gave them: faith. He told them the gods stood with Persia, that prophecy was not a curse, but a mission. The Persians listened and saw in him not just a prince, but a saviour. Village by village, tribe by tribe, they left the Median shadow and joined Cyrus's ranks. The revolt exploded. At first, it was small skirmishes. Median detachments ambushed in valleys, cut off in deserts, stripped of supplies and spirit. Cyrus's forces were few, but they had the advantage. Persians knew every ravine, every spring, every goat trail across the plateau. Median soldiers pampered in luxury were clumsy, like beasts driven into traps. The decisive clash came when Astyages himself led the grand army. Sources say he entrusted command to a general who secretly sided with Cyrus. When the two forces met, instead of fighting to the death, the Median lines fractured from within. Some deserted, some froze, some even turned their spears. The dark humour. The battle did not end in glorious bloodshed, but in the cruel truth that soldiers no longer cared to die for an old king. Cyrus surged forward. The Persians pressed the advantage. From his chariot, Astyages watched his troops scatter like panicked sheep. The hunter of his grandson had become the hunted. The city of Ecbatana, the Median capital, opened its gates in surrender. There was no massacre, no rivers of blood, but the outcome was harsher. Media, once master of the region, collapsed, and Cyrus sat on his grandfather's throne. That moment closed the circle of fate. The child, once sentenced to death because of prophecy, now fulfilled it. Astyages was captured alive, but Cyrus spared him, letting him live out his final years in the shadow of defeat. The dark humour. The king who feared prophecy so much he tried to kill his grandson, lived long enough to watch that grandson sit on his throne. With this victory, Cyrus became not only king of Persia, but of Media as well. Two peoples, once master and subject, were now united under a single banner. This was the first foundation stone of the Persian Empire, something the world had never seen before. An empire beyond tribe, stretching toward the idea of universal. And it all began with a shepherd's revolt, led by the child once abandoned in the desert. In that moment, The winds of the Persian plateau carried more than the scent of dry grass and hot sand. They carried the smell of a newborn empire, of ambition, of history shifting its weight. And its name, from that day onward, would echo across the four corners of the earth. Cyrus. After defeating his grandfather and uniting Media, Cyrus didn't stop. An empire can't survive on a single victory. It has to expand, swallow new lands, or it will starve on its own throne. And Cyrus's first prey was Lydia, the wealthy kingdom of Asia Minor, ruled by King Croesus, the man famously called the richest in the world. If you've ever heard the phrase, rich as Croesus, remember, this was the man who walked around, glittering with gold and silver like the living, breathing version of a mobile ATM. Croesus believed the gods were on his side. Before marching out, he asked Apollo what would happen if he attacked Persia. The oracle at Delphi gave the usual cryptic reply, "You will destroy a mighty empire." Croesus laughed, convinced it meant Persia. The dark humour? A mighty empire was indeed destroyed, it just happened to be his own Lydia. The decisive clash came at Thymbra in 547 BC. Croesus rolled in with chariots, heavy infantry, and treasure piled high, while Cyrus used cunning. He lined up camels at the front, knowing the Lydian horses would panic at their smell. The cavalry broke ranks, the chariots faltered, and Croesus's army collapsed. The richest man in the world was caught like a fish on a hook. They say when Croesus was bound to the pyre, he cried out for Solon, the Athenian philosopher who once warned that no man should call himself happy until he sees how his life ends, because fate can flip in an instant. Cyrus heard this, was moved, ordered the flames put out, and spared Croesus. Instead of ashes, Croesus became an advisor, a living symbol that Cyrus conquered not only with the sword, but also with mercy. After Lydia, Persia swallowed the smaller kingdoms of Asia Minor, one by one. Piece by piece, the map changed colour from others into Persia. Cyrus wasn't just an invader, he was an architect, laying brick after brick of a colossal structure called the First Empire in history. For the first time, a state was not built on one tribe or one people, but on many different nations, languages and religions bound together in a vast arc stretching from the Iranian plateau to the Aegean coast. To those alive then, Cyrus wasn't just king of Persia, he was king of kings. He was both shepherd and storm, and from a small dismissed tribe, he made Persia into the power every kingdom had to bow to when their ships docked or their caravans crossed the long roads. But if Lydia was only a golden gem, Babylon was the diamond of the age. On the Euphrates, Babylon was the stuff of legend. Sky-high walls, the hanging gardens, towering temples. Whoever controlled Babylon held the beating heart of civilization. And Cyrus knew, if he wanted his empire to become legend, he had to take Babylon. In 539 BC, he marched south. King Nabonidus of Babylon arrogantly believed his city was untouchable. Walls towering, storehouses full, and the Euphrates running through the city. Anyone dreaming of capturing Babylon might as well dream of plucking the moon. But Cyrus didn't attack with blood, he attacked with brains. He ordered canals dug, diverting the Euphrates until the river inside the city ran shallow. In the dead of night, while Babylonians slept in their pride, Persian soldiers crept into the city along the empty riverbed. The dark humour, one of the world's most unconquerable cities, fell not to advanced weapons but to not enough water to drown a soldier's head. By morning, Persian banners flew above the Ishtar gate. No massacre, no rivers of blood. On the contrary, Cyrus ordered temples protected, honoured the god Marduk, and treated the people with respect. The Babylonians, already weary of Nabonidus's rule, welcomed him as a liberator. In that moment, Cyrus became a living legend. The conquest of Babylon was more than a victory. It was a redefinition of power. Cyrus was not just a conqueror, he was a deliverer. He issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem after years of exile, an act so profound that the Bible calls him the anointed of the Lord. His empire was built, not just on fear, but on acceptance, on the consent of many peoples, and that made Persia different from anything that came before. From Ecbatana to Sardis, from Babylon to the Mediterranean coast, Cyrus stitched together something the world had never seen. An empire that didn't just rule, but organized, managed, and inspired. And Babylon's fall was the door that opened it all, transforming Cyrus from king of one people into king of the known world. After conquering Babylon, Cyrus didn't act like an invader out to plunder, but like a guest invited to restore order, and it was this behavior that set him apart from the tyrants of his age. People often say, history is written in the blood of the defeated. But with Cyrus, history was written in tolerance. The clearest proof lies in a small immortal object, the Cyrus cylinder, a clay tablet often called the first declaration of human rights. On it, Cyrus proclaimed that he came not to destroy, but to liberate. He declared he would respect the gods of Babylon, restore desecrated temples, and allow exiled peoples to return home. It wasn't just diplomatic rhetoric, it was brilliant political strategy. When the conqueror respects your faith, you don't see him as an enemy, but as a protector. The Jews were living proof. After decades of exile in Babylon, they were allowed by Cyrus to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. In the Bible, Cyrus is praised not just as a great king, but as the anointed of the Lord. The dark humor of history, a pagan Persian king was hailed as God's instrument, while so many kings of God before him had driven the Jews into exile. What made Cyrus extraordinary was that he understood force could conquer land, but only tolerance could conquer hearts. As the Persian army marched through territories, he didn't force locals to abandon their gods, learn Persian, or worship his own deities. Instead, he let them keep their customs as long as they paid taxes and swore loyalty to the throne. That policy turned a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual empire into a smoothly running machine. Nobody felt crushed. Everyone felt part of something greater. For the great cities, Cyrus never destroyed them as a show of dominance. On the contrary, he protected them as treasures. Babylon's walls still stood. Marduk's temple still smoked with incense. Jerusalem was reborn. Sardis stayed prosperous. That transformed people from enemies into subjects. You could say Cyrus didn't rule with the sword, he ruled with a firm handshake, tight but never breaking. Of course, Cyrus wasn't a saint. He was still a warrior, still expanding his empire with blood and fire. But he knew something others didn't. Slaughter alone can't hold an empire, you have to make people believe they belong in it. The dark humor. If Alexander the Great is remembered as the blood-drunk conqueror who died young, Cyrus is remembered as the king who played fair, at least in the political sense. That's why Cyrus's name spread far beyond Persia. He's mentioned in the Bible, recorded by Herodotus in Greek histories, and held up as a model for rulers after him. Even enemies didn't call him tyrant, they called him the just king. In a world where war and massacre were the norm, Cyrus was a rare exception, a conqueror whom history still dares to call a liberator. And it was this policy of tolerance that made Cyrus's Persia not a shaky empire waiting to collapse, but a powerful one that expanded and left a lasting legacy. People can argue about how he died, but no one denies that he lived and ruled like a master of statecraft. A man who knew that real power didn't lie in burning cities, but in making cities open their gates willingly. An empire that vast couldn't run on the charisma of its king alone. It needed a machine, and Cyrus understood this better than anyone. He wasn't just a warrior, he was an engineer of power. The first Persian empire in history wasn't a loose collection of tribes, but a massive administrative engine, where every gear and every bolt locked perfectly into place. Cyrus divided the empire into satrapies, huge provinces, each governed by a satrap. Every satrap had sweeping powers: collect taxes, maintain order, command local troops. But to keep them from rebelling, Cyrus placed beside each one the eyes and ears of the king, secret inspectors. The dark humor? It was the ancient surveillance system, where even a tavern whisper could reach the king's ear faster than the postal service. To tie the empire together, Cyrus and his successors built the Royal Road, stretching more than 2,500 kilometers, from Susa to Sardis. Along the way stood relay stations with fresh horses, so couriers could ride at unheard-of speeds. Herodotus once said, "Nothing mortal travels faster than the king's couriers." If you want a comparison, this was FedEx of the ancient world. A letter from the capital could reach the frontier in just a week, while in medieval Europe, the same distance might take months. It wasn't just roads. Cyrus organized archives and record-keeping. Taxes were carefully logged, army numbers listed, food stores accounted for. The Persian Empire ruled millions, yet didn't drown in chaos because they had something most states of that age lacked: bureaucracy. The dark humor? If today you've ever had to stand in line for a government stamp, thank Cyrus. He was one of the first to invent the power of paperwork. That machine turned Persia into the first empire able to control a stretch of land from India to the Mediterranean, not just ruling but integrating. Many peoples, many tongues, many gods, all tied together by one system, one road, one set of laws. That was Cyrus's greatest achievement, turning diversity into strength instead of weakness. And the machine he built survived long after his death, becoming the backbone for kings who followed. But if administration was the empire's brain, the army was its fist, and Cyrus knew how to turn that fist into legend. The Persian army wasn't powerful just because of its size, but because of its organization and diversity. This was the first army in history that looked like a multinational force. Cavalry from Tenure, Bactria, archers from Elam, light infantry from Lydia, chariots from Media. Every people contributed their specialty, forming a composite war machine. The peak of that force was the Immortals' 10,000 elite soldiers, always kept at exactly that number. If one died or was wounded, another instantly filled the gap. On the battlefield, they seemed never to falter, never to shrink as if immortal. Picture thousands of warriors in shining armor, long spears, massive shields, advancing in perfect step. That sight alone terrified enemies. The dark humor? They weren't immortal because they couldn't die, they were immortal because there was always a replacement ready, the way big companies always have resumes stacked at the door. The Immortals weren't just soldiers, they were a symbol of stability. Their presence in the capital made any would-be rebel tremble. On the battlefield, they were the spearhead. In ceremony, they were the stage show of power, reminding foreign envoys that behind the throne stood strength that could not be broken. Cyrus used his army not to destroy, but to deter. A small town, hearing that the 10,000 Immortals were marching in, would open its gates without a fight. The power was in the image. A force that never thinned was the living reminder that the Persian Empire never weakened. The mix inside the Persian army reflected Cyrus's philosophy. A conqueror didn't need to erase identities, only to harness them. Scythians good at horseback riding, make them cavalry. Lydians skilled with bows, turn them into archers. Medes gifted in ironwork, put them in the forges. The empire didn't crush their culture, it repurposed it for something greater. That made the Persian army not just massive, but flexible, layered, and frightening. The Immortals, together with the bureaucracy and the royal road, turned Cyrus's empire into a living body, with a head, a heart, and a fist. A body that thrived not only on violence, but on intelligence, organization, and symbols. And in the dim light of a torch, when the spears of the Immortals glinted like stars, you understand why enemies trembled at the name Cyrus. He wasn't just a man, he was the face of an unbreakable machine. No empire is immortal, and no king escapes fate. After countless victories, after building a vast machine of rule, Cyrus still carried the hunger every conqueror shares, to go further, to push beyond borders, to prove no land could escape Persia's grasp. And that hunger led him to a tragic end on the Central Asian steppe. His final enemy wasn't a wealthy empire, but the Massagetae, a nomadic tribe of the grasslands, ruled by Queen Tomiris. The Greeks described her as a warrior in armor, with bow and blade, eyes burning like fire. For Cyrus, this wasn't just conquest, it was a duel of honor. If Persia stood for civilization, Massagetae embodied the wild, and their clash would decide whether civilization could consume the wild, or whether the wild was the true unbreakable force. At first, Cyrus used cunning. He set up a false camp, stacked with wine and food, then withdrew. The Massagetae, unaccustomed to wine, stormed in, feasted, drank, and fell unconscious. The Persians returned, slaughtered many, and captured Tomiris's son. It was a brutal strike, but also a fatal mistake. Tomiris didn't cower. She swore vengeance in blood. She gathered her entire host, and in the next battle, the Persians used to foes with walls and roads found themselves lost in a sea of grass and wild horsemen. The fight turned into a massacre. Persian ranks were surrounded, splintered, and cut down. Cyrus, the king who had conquered Lydia and Babylon, fell not before a mighty empire, but on an alien plain, under the hand of a nomad queen. Legend says Tomiris found his body, severed his head, dropped it into a skin bag of blood, and declared, "You thirsted for blood, so drink your fill. The dark humor of fate. The man who built an empire with blood and strategy was returned to blood, as though mocked by history itself. Cyrus's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a reminder that not even the King of Kings could outpace destiny. But his legacy didn't fall with his body. The empire he built stood strong, expanding further under his heirs. Cyrus died, but his name did not. It lived on in legend, in memory, in the very way humanity came to understand power. Looking back on Cyrus the Great's journey, we see a story not just of conquest, but of how one man rewrote the rules of rule. From a child nearly slain in his cradle, he rose to topple his grandfather, swallow Lydia, bring down Babylon, and forge the first empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. But what made him immortal wasn't victory alone, it was how he ruled. Unlike many tyrants of his age, Cyrus understood an empire couldn't survive on iron and blood alone. He let peoples keep their gods, their temples, their identities. He didn't erase, he connected. From the Cyrus cylinder to freeing the Jews, everything showed he saw beyond his century. If Alexander the Great was a fire that flared bright and burned out, Cyrus was the steady torch that left a light for others to follow. The machine he built, the satrap system, the royal road, the immortals kept running for centuries after his death. It gave successors like Darius and Xerxes the foundation to expand Persia, to clash with Greece, to be written into history. Without Cyrus's groundwork, there might never have been Marathon or Thermopylae. Cyrus's legacy went beyond politics. In the Bible, he was the Lord's anointed. In Greek history, he was the just king. In modern thought, he became the father of human rights. From the dust of empire, his name spread like a desert wind, reaching even into the ideals of modern civilization. Picture yourself standing before Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae, where the inscription reads simply, "O man, I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire. Do not begrudge me this little tomb." In that simplicity lies a lesson. No matter how great power grows, it turns to dust. What remains is how you used it. Cyrus is remembered not for a throne of gold, but for the way other people saw him, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. That is why Cyrus still lives in humanity's memory. His name is written in scripture, carved in stone, sung in epic and legend. He wasn't perfect. He died in blood, in tragedy, but that imperfection makes him closer, more human, more real. And as we close his story, we don't only recall battles, armies, or cities taken. We remember a boy abandoned in the desert who rose to change the world. A king who knew true victory wasn't forcing others to kneel, but raising them to stand beside him. And we remember that while power may vanish, the name of one who wielded it wisely can echo forever, like the endless wind across the desert.